Well, um, yes, I'm not good at this, but Professor Spills, um, it is an honor to introduce Hortense Spillers, and not only because, but especially because Hortense means gardener, or because Hortensia, daughter of Quintus Hortensius, is known for a speech she made against taxing women when they had no political representation. And she looks like the beautiful hydrangea, which is what a hortense is. Did you know that? You knew all that. But it's especially an honor because I want to say something nice about you. Not that you need hear it from me, but I want to say your complexly argued and brilliantly articulated essays, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book, and all the things you could be by now if Sigmund Freud's wife was your mother, continue to be central in the fields of Black feminist studies. Her heroic academic efforts, as exemplified in these essays, have for a generation now unveiled and explicated the multiple strategies by which Black women identities have been overdetermined by the histories of slavery, racism, and imperial power. We are grateful to her for the way she has brought together the interdisciplinary exploration that concerns gender, race, and psychoanalysis and diasporic geographies. Her critical moves here in this area have forever changed and enriched the landscape of cultural studies. She has been attentive to the psychological and corporeal sacrifices Black women of the Caribbean and elsewhere in the African diaspora in general have had to make throughout history. I especially appreciate her beautiful achievements in filling the silences which have inhabited Black women's lives. Yesterday, on the occasion of her first of 3 talks, she unfolded the life of Sally Hemings for us, and we were privileged to sample the skillful restoration work which is at the heart of Professor Spiller's genius. To paraphrase Toni Morrison, silences were broken, lost things were found. Professor Spillers has bequeathed to us a new grammar that liberates Black lives from the constraints of single qualifiers and utterances, and that brings forth the complexities of identity and experience and of the multiple histories women have endured. We are all indebted to her, and here I borrow from one of her essays on Black women's sexuality, for providing the interstice or the missing word to speak at all. In this same piece, she writes that because African American women as cultural and social agents have not participated in the dominant legacies of symbolic order, they have the fortune of traveling beyond the normal paradigms to reach great depths of seductive semiotic power. As a writer and a woman, I find this terribly inspiring. Please welcome Professor Hortense Spillers.
I never imagined being introduced by Jamaica Kincaid. That was really wonderful. Skip should have prepared me for that. When he introduced us, I just kind of went, "What? She's going to introduce me? What?" All right, thank you so much for coming back today. I have something of a sore throat, so that if it looks like my voice is giving out, I will just stop and have a bit of water. You know, when you're getting ready for the Du Bois lectures, you stop sleeping. And so things happen to you when you don't sleep and eat, right? In 1987, Louis Salamolin, Salamolin, published a full text complete with critical commentary of the French Black Code, Le Code Noir, and subtitles his project The Calvary of Canaan. We might also translate le calvaire de Canaan as the crucifixion of Canaan. Le Code Noir began its journey in Versailles at the court of the Sun King, Louis XIV, in March 1685, and was terminated a little short of 2 centuries later in April 1848 at the commencement of what Solomon calls the ephemeral Second Republic. The 18th century saw at least 3 iterations of the code in 1745, 1767, and 1788. Solomon's text is based on the 1767 edition of the code that was reproduced in facsimile, unaccompanied by historiographical marginalia or critical commentary, by the historical societies of Guadeloupe at Basse-Terre, Guadeloupe and Martinique at Fort-de-France in 1980. My own attempt to translate and read this text sometime in the 90s has been compelled by my interest in comparative diasporic studies, but more than that, my curiosity about the fate of the partus sequitur ventrum. I think literally that translates part follows the belly, which determines the fate of the newborn by the condition of the mother. This generational succession of bondage strikes me as the sine qua non of the peculiar institution, so that this specific naming of the female in her reproductive career takes us, it seems to me, to the very heart of the matter. From it, we trace the route of the reproductive function in polar opposition to the capacity to order one's world, and in its association with the blood element traffics in the unspeakable, which eludes the public world of political address. I'm riffing here, as you will recognize, on a number of thinkers, many of them feminist theorists, and other investigators, among them Ivan Hannaford in his study of the idea of race in the West. Early on in Hannaford's text, he works meticulously at establishing what the idea of the political was in the classical world, and he sees it in radical contradistinction to the notion of race. For him, the idea of the political represents what he calls an enormous leap that we have failed to fully appreciate, inasmuch as it is emerging in an historical context where order had previously depended on the observation of the hierarchical rules pertaining to household, family, clan, and tribe. In Greece and Rome, he observes, the transition from kith and kin to polity, from blood relationship to political relationship, cannot be explained using natural, evolutionary, or genetic criteria. One way to read this comment is to hear in its implications the division of social labor that will come to be named public and private spheres of interest, and their theoretically rigorous gender protocols. In any case, the ancient properties of the bloodline, as I think the male authored it and understood it, female power runs parallel with notions of contamination, defilement, ambiguity, obscurity, so that the domestic in this outline is perceived in proximity to filth. If you add color to this heady mix, and the spectacle, or then the spectacle of a consummate degradation is complete. So the code, as a 17th century text, is the oldest codification of law that I know that is related to the regulation of commerce in the traffic of African peoples under enslavement, which lends another reason for my interest in it. By comparison, laws governing the bonded in colonial North America were taken up colony by colony and entered the records of the transactions of state legislatures by degree. Not until 1705, for example, does the Virginia Assembly articulate the defining provision that removes all doubt of the synonymity between skin color and the status of enslavement. Quote, all Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves in all courts of judicature and other places within this dominion shall be held, taken, and adjudged to be real estate. Even though black people by the closing decades of the 17th century were beginning to lose their ambiguity of status, historians tend to agree that the rigorous demands of servitude, indentured servitude, applied early on across the racial fault line. So as we know, it sounds like the first generation of African peoples on these shores, 1619, in colonial Jamestown, were of ambiguous status. According to Helen Catterall's massive study of legislative proceedings in each of the North American colonies, there were some 10 classes of indentured service spelled out in early Virginia statutes, somewhere between 1619 and 1640, or after 1640, things began to change. As historian Thad Tate explains it, like other servants, the Negroes completed a period of service and became free men. Some of them became landowners and masters of other servants. One Anthony Johnson, for instance, is reported in Tate's work on black folk in 18th century Williamsburg. Anthony Johnson came to Virginia Colony in 1621, and within a couple of years had finished his servitude. He takes a wife in 1622, acquires property, and imports Negro servants of his own and develops a small African community in Northampton County, Virginia. So there is then no single event that augurs and argues the inevitability of slavery, which would cast it in divine order, if there were such a thing, and rob it of its historicity, but rather it appears by slow degree and day by day, the African community is systematically divested of its civic potential, as paradoxically the colonies and the colonists gain their own stride toward freedom. So those movements that work in contradistinction, which is, I think, a very great irony that historians draw our attention to. So slavery and freedom, the long-held conceptual antitheses, wax together so that, as Susan Buck Morse would have it in Hegel, Haiti, and Universal History, quote, the discourse of freedom and the practice of slavery marked the ascendancy of a succession of Western nations within the early modern global economy. If for Enlightenment thinkers, Salomon's Lumiere, freedom is the highest and universal political value, then the idea begins to take root, Buck Morris goes on, at precisely the time that the economic practice of slavery, the systematic, highly sophisticated, capitalist enslavement of non-Europeans as a labor force in the colonies was increasing quantitatively and increasing qualitatively to the point that by the mid-18th century, it came to underwrite the entire economic system of the West, paradoxically facilitating the global spread of the very Enlightenment ideals that were in such fundamental contradiction to it. As used as we are to the notion, this twinning of these antithetical views of the human still rivets the imagination as a precise impossibility. One cannot speak of freedom without conjuring up its negation. Salomon's study of Le Code Noir that audaciously indicts Enlightenment thinkers for what he calls their silence on the question of slavery and the code, sustains a posture of indignation toward both the oblivion to the matter of slavery that exists in official French scholarship and the, quote, obscene nudity of its articles, as he puts it, that reflects centuries of exegesis on African humanity, beginning with the canonical authors. From what he tells the reader, the confrontation that he poses here between the philosophers and black slavery, particularly Montesquieu and Rousseau, has netted him a great deal of ridicule in some quarters. But ridicule in this case seems justification enough for a late 20th century dossier on the code that, quote, regulated the coldest utilitarian genocide of modernity, as he puts it. So as Marx of Capital leaves blood on the floor, so to speak, in taking on the political economists with whom he disagrees, so Salomonin assumes the posture of aggressively taking on the French intellectual world in navigating his way without apology through the minefields of his theoretical predecessors as well as his contemporaries. At the end of a calendar of events which he inaugurates with 8 January 1454 and Pope Nicholas V's authorization to the King of Portugal to practice the trade, Salomonin marks the second centennial of the Code by noting the convening of the Berlin Conference in 1885, the third centennial of the Code in 1985, and how the French handled it. The occasion, he explains, was completely ignored by the French press, radio, and television. Then in a separate sidebar on the page, there is this evocation. 9 December 1948, the definition of genocide, adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations. Recognizing that in all periods of history, genocide has inflicted great losses on humanity, the General Assembly proclaims, in the present convention, genocide means any one of the following acts committed with the intention of destroying in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, including A, the murder of members of the group, B, a serious attack on the physical and mental integrity of the group, C, the intentional subjection of a group to conditions of existence with the view of bringing about its total or partial physical destruction, D, measures aimed at hampering births within the group, and E, the coercive transfer of the children of the group to another group. It seems to me that the inclusion of this UN Convention on Suicide is not an ocious gesture on Salomonin's part. Given the time frame of the convention, it is coming within earshot of the cessation of hostilities among nations at global war and the unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust. but the implied reflexive gesture that he performs here, for all the complexities of such a move and nation states in our era tending to shy away from the term, he backdates the concept of genocide to the transatlantic slave trade that had already been in motion for 2.5 centuries before the promulgation of Le Code Noir. Solomon, in response to those who felt that he wanted to, quote, take down and belittle the philosophers, offers that his aims were far more modest. By preparing another edition of the Code and bringing parallel alongside it the career of the most glorious philosophical period of French culture, he was departing from the monster of oblivion in concern about the nation's political health, and to offer to whomever wished it an accurate instrument for pondering the failures of a thought whose success one is obligated to rein in. It takes the reader a while to reach the articles themselves, but the care that he takes to set the scene and to examine in considerable detail the nuances of the Code and its intellectual and conceptual predecessors reaps its rewards in the second part of the text. And I want to just briefly mention one of the threads that he follows in the commentary and its ramifying consequences, and that is the name Canaan, with whose career we are already quite familiar. This is the story, of course, of Noah and his 3 sons, the story that is told in the 9th chapter of Genesis, the 20th through the 27th verses. Specifically, the error, as we know, that Ham commits will be transmuted as the malediction that falls on successive generations of Ham's children, beginning with his son Canaan. The trail of biblical exegesis that follows Ham's curse is a long and tortuous one, as we know, but suffice it to say that the curse became one of the preeminent rationalizations, and we also know that slaveholders adopted to their arsenal of defense for not only upholding the practice of slavery, but for sustaining such practices over 4 centuries of early modern and modern industrial history. In short, the descendants of Ham, installed in distant regions, in unknown lands, will emerge in the literature of the white Japhéti, Solomon argues, as concomitant with black Africa. Now, this geographical rationale, among a host of other reasons for the infliction of enslavement on New World Africans, and as one of the inspiriting motivations behind race thinking, is also investigated in recent work by Nell Painter in her 2010 History of White People. As Painter explains, classical writers, Hippocrates and Herodotus among them, turned to climate, airs, waters, and places to account for human difference. Successive generations of scholars and writers will elaborate the Hamitic thesis as the exegetical tradition allows the whole of the black African population to be contained in Canaanite paternity. Eventually, color is wed to geographical features and political cultural space in fashioning not only the textual density of black Africa, but its actual and material circumstance. Solomon would have us bear in mind that the Code's preamble and first article drive home the idea that royal authority is advancing this document for the benefit of its officers and agents in the colonial isles of America in order to maintain the discipline of the, quote, Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman Church. That the Code conforms to a messianic project is spelled out in the first article that mandates the expulsion of Jewish people within 3 months of the publication of the code from the American islands because of their declared enmity, the document reads, to the Christian name. Everywhere, then, references to the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion permeate the provisions of the document in order to justify its declarations concerning a repertoire of human activity from birthing to marriage to buying and selling. Relatedly, Article 2 demands the baptism of the enslaved recently brought to the islands and their instruction in the religion of the Catholic Church. We would be forgiven for regarding this obsessive gaze at the church, and indeed at religiosity, as a primary motivation with a great deal of cynicism, because the drafters, the Sun King's ministers, speak plainly as though slavery were as natural as breathing in the air. Never once, apparently, is there stuttering or throat clearing in the syntax. For example, we enjoin the inhabitants who buy newly arrived Negroes, for example, moves right along with dispatch to the end of the period. And we observe this language of decree, of words and aggressive action, as one of the quite astonishing stylistic dimensions of Le Code Noir. Colin Diane argues in Haiti, History and the Gods that the work of the Marquis de Sade might be read as a literalization of the Black Code and a record of those practices that exceeded its regulations. Determined to strip French history of its glory, Sade brought out the truth, she goes on, at the heart of the traffic in slaves, not only economic gain, but the tempting and pleasurable reduction of human into thing, like a persistent drone that subtends some lighter rhythm, in this case economic gain under the aegis of the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion, the reduction of human to thing, and the remarkably unquestioned commerce that drives it everywhere infuses this document with so odious an intention that its feints of high moral and religious motivation even deceive it. Articles 8 through 13 concerning marriage and concubinage bear out this sense of a reading and bring us to a point of focus. Article 8 declares that subjects of the king who are not of the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion are incapable of contracting valid marriages, and that children born of such liaisons are illegitimate, as they will be held and reputed to be true conjunctions of concubinage. Annette Gordon Reed points out that under the laws of Virginia, quote, any child born out of wedlock was considered filius nullius, the child of no one, or as some commentators have put it, the child of everyone, filius nullius. So this canny manipulation of the rituals of union in the case of the code and the social status of children in both instances seems designed to reinforce the juridical negation of the enslaved. No civil rights are accorded to or recognized in the bondsman and woman, which extends by way of the imposition of illegitimacy to heritable rights as well. This disingenuous reliance on the evocation of the sacraments of marriage in the case of the code might be regarded as yet one more ruse for the absolute police power that authority wielded over its subordinates. Article 9 makes free men who have had children with concubines subject to penalty. But interestingly, the masters of the enslaved, with whom the masters have had children, will be deprived of the enslaved and the children and the latter confiscated to the hospital. And I will have to ask our historians to explain what this confiscation to the hospital is. I couldn't quite figure that out. And without benefit of emancipation, or without the power of emancipation inhering in the enslaved. This article does not apply when the free man, in the event that he was not already married at the time of his concubinage, marries the enslaved woman, but only in the forms observed by the church. The enslaved female is liberated in this way, and her children rendered, quote, free and legitimate. If one reads an article like this one in isolation from the environing context, it will appear that the outlined procedure offers a possible route out of bondage. But the involute and labyrinthine modifications and exceptions that qualify and contradict any given rule, or any given rule in relationship to another provision or rule, would suggest that the entire code, as Solomon contends, is fashioned to assure the generational succession of enslavement, the matrilineal transmission of freedom or bondage, and the juridical disempowerment of the subordinate. Article 10 mandates that the solemnities of marriage will be observed for free and slave alike without entailing the consent of the parents of the enslaved, the only necessary and compulsory approval that of the masters. Article 11 expressly forbids priests from officiating at marriage ceremonies of the enslaved without the master's approval. This article further specifies that the owner is forbidden to use whatever measures of constraint at his disposal to force the enslaved to marry against their will. Solomon argues that it is rather pointless to linger over this provision that is supposed to prevent the masters from exercising a force of will, inasmuch as the enslaved certainly has no ability to haul a master into court or question his will otherwise. Relatedly, Article 30 spells out the inability of the enslaved to constitute himself, herself as an agent by anyone not the master for managing or negotiating any matter or becoming arbiters, experts, or witnesses in any civil or criminal procedure. For all intents and purposes, the enslaved, from the point of view of the law, has no agency that another is bound to respect. And the Saint-Domingue Revolution will offer an answer to that question in the next century. Given Article 30's definitive categories that negate agential possibility in the enslaved, Solomon is right to declare that it is highly improbable that an enslaved person's complaint against a master would have been met with the least efficacy. Article 12 specifies that the children born of enslaved parents will be enslaved, but that the children will belong to the master of the female rather than the master of the male if the pair is of different masters. Solomon calls this provision the height of slavery's disaster, insofar as it locks up the future of the enslaved in a kind of timelessness, in an eternal night of repetition. Of the 6 articles that bear on concubinage in marriage, Article 13 decrees that if an enslaved husband is married to a free woman, the children, male and female, will follow the condition of the mother, the servitude of the father notwithstanding, and that if the father is free and the mother enslaved, the children will be enslaved as well. Supplementary prohibitions provided by ordinances adopted after 1685 disallow any marriage between white subjects of either sex with black men and women. The penultimate article of the code, number 59, grants To any freed person, all the rights, privileges, and immunities enjoyed by persons born free. The article goes on to wish that the merit of acquired liberty will produce for them, their person, as well as their goods, the same effects that the happiness of natural liberty brings to other subjects of the crown. Solomon pauses at the notion of same rights of access as others because it does not mean, he argues, access to nobility, which he thinks was not a minor barrier in the era of the old regime, nor access to classes of whites, and particularly those subjects affected by feudal and seigneurial rights, many of which will be swept away by revolution. Signed by the king and his minister Colbert, and signed with the Great Seal in red and green folds of silk. The document was read, published, and registered at Saint-Domingue on the 6th of May, 1687. This synthesis of a body of law inspired by biblical exegesis and Roman law, by Christianity and canonical law, brings into harmonious accord royal will and religious authority. We might think of it as a kind of ground zero for French-speaking Antillean communities on which an elaborate structure of feeling as well as protocols of practice might be erected. As Solomon observes, a stiffening of procedure toward the enslaved as the 18th century is crossed, so historians of the American South remark the locking in place of the enslaved in this colonial location and the airtight synonymity that is drawn between slavery and skin color. Even in the case of the freed, liberty might be regarded as the mirage that Solomon believes it is in Article 59 of the Code, quote, controlled in their comings and goings, surveilled in their sexual and familial life, forbidden vacations, constrained in their use of certain nominatives and vestimentary forms, the victims of 1,001 discriminations. The enslaved, even in acquired liberty, was scandalously far from feeling the effects of out-and-out liberty. Solomon notes that whenever distant people of color might have been from their origins, they always bore the stain of their enslavement and were, as a result, declared incapable of any and all public function. This observation would seem to imply that race thinking, even early on, generated a spatial dimension of a racialized perception of identity. To be public, to be publicly known in one's activities must be quintessential to our notions of public sphere membership, a notion with which revolutionary regimes would have to critically conjure, since for the first time subject becomes citizen would mean precisely the right to appear in public with one's own claims, to assume representability both in one's own person and in the surrogations of representative democracy. If one cannot go herself, himself, he or she can sin go. This is the right to franchise. The distinction then between the presentation of a public face and being denied the right to it is precisely the difference between visibility and invisibility. Solomon addresses a number of provisions supplemental to the code and introduced in the 18th century that bear on the spatial prescriptions of the non-white public face. For example, from 1733, the king decrees that, quote, any mixed race inhabitant can exercise no responsibility in the judiciary or in the military, And he added that any inhabitant who marries a negress or a mulatto cannot be an officer nor gain any employment in the colonies. Mixed-race persons cannot have any professions that places them, any profession that places them even remotely close to judicial functions or dispositions not related to themselves, for these occupations can hardly be entrusted to persons whose probity is not recognized and which one cannot presume to meet in a birth so vile as that of the mulatto. What actually takes place on the ground is far more complicated, as we know, than the absolute pronouncement of the royal wish. But the latter offers a gauge for measuring the self-induced problematic of the mulatto, or the implications of cross-racial Congress, or even the social calculus that concatenates with the confusions of black and white. Shanti Singham, in her study of the racial problematic in pre-revolutionary France, points out that the code had actually brought about a substantial number of mulattoes and free black people in the Antilles, and that many mulattoes owned plantations and slaves. In the prelude to revolution, Singham notes, mulattoes owned about a quarter of the land and a third of the slaves in Saint-Domingue. As we know from C.L.R. James's magisterial narrative of what unfolds in the metropolis pursuant to doings in the colony and vice versa, the mulatto class of subjects will become a vital chapter in the drive toward black liberation, both in the sense that they were not able to enforce a strict enough line of separation between themselves and the enslaved, and that in the maneuverings of the Paris revolutionaries, they were eventually forced to fall out on the side of black revolt. As we encounter the laws regarding slavery and the enslaved, it remains most remarkable reading because it still retains the power to shock. Empirically, thousands of people who will grow into the millions by the period of emancipation in the United States and throughout the New World complex are held in thrall, not for what they've done, but for who they are. The business of slavery in the Antilles does not only insufficiently concern Montesquieu and Rousseau, is Salam Alan's argument, but the revolutionaries of 1789 also miss it as well, until the thunderous flowering of Saint-Domingue reminds them. It was ironically the situation of the enslaved from which the repertory of revolutionary metaphor and rhetorical motive freely borrowed. As the revolutionaries read it, it was the revolutionaries who were the slaves. It was they who had to break their own chains and free themselves from their tyrants. As David Bryan Davis notes in The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolution, the English colonists' language of slavery magnified the rights of freemen, and slavery therefore brought Virginians into the same Commonwealth political tradition with New Englanders. Their rhetoric of freedom, he goes on, was functionally related to the existence and in many areas to the continuation of Negro slavery. We hear strains of such reversal, Davis calls it, in one of Jefferson's first published documents, penned in 1774, which is a kind of run-up to the Declaration. This 1774 document is entitled A Summer Review of the Rights of British America. He is addressing the British monarch there concerning, among other things, the tardiness with which matters of justice are settled in Virginia colony, And in this particular section, he poses a series of rhetorical questions, one of which is this: does His Majesty seriously wish and publish it to the world that his subjects should give up the glorious right of representation with all the benefits derived from that and submit themselves the absolute slaves of his sovereign will? But as we've observed before, the build-up to the revolutionary scene in both the French and American instances split off the colonists' growing concern for his own freedom from the quite obvious and glaring contradiction of slavery itself. Davis calls this a heritage of inconsistency, and it seems to me that it is one of the most galling features of the entire Western procedure over the long haul, from the promulgation of Le Code Noir to the English and American abolition of the slave trade to the bloody peace of Appomattox at the weary end, which was also another beginning. I don't quite know how to describe my feverish objection to the coldness of the French Code or the body of law that slavery engendered in the South of the North American colonies. The rhetoric of law itself, stripped down to the nub of any given occasion, seems to lose any hint of actual human hoping, aspiring life, buried beneath its highness that deigns to touch the ground. Indeed, in the mirror of legal rhetoric, I, the shifting pronoun, is lost to sight, and what emerges in its place is something of a cipher out of time, but rather clocked instead by the mechanisms of an impartial device that appears to be wielded by no one. And that's the terror of it, I feel, most poignantly experienced when a ruling comes down, for example, from the current iteration of the United States Supreme Court. It is not only that I disagree with so many of its rulings, the Ledbetter case, the Citizens United ruling, its latest disposition on the Voting Rights Act, its upholding a strategy designed by North Carolina political operatives to eliminate an entire week of early voting in that state. But aside from my relentless antipathy, I think I most resent what seems to me an inexplicable indifference to the needs of the society for whom the court rules, and an apparently flawed sense on the part of some of the justices that human subjects are not Pavlovian entities set in motion by abstract procedures and conclusions. But that's the law, we are to suppose, as my partner who is a lawyer always tells me. So there are many kicking out of bad fights about this particular thing here called the law. Okay. So yes, that's the law. So that in the mirror of Le Code Noir and the Southern laws of slavery, the subject of the law is not the mute humanity that constitutes the object of its gaze, but rather it is the framers themselves in their role as surrogate Godhead. Negroes, mulattoes, slaves, etc., are like play toys to an overriding legion of power over life and death. For the most part, we are apprised in these documents not of human movement, but of the transfer and transportation and poses and dispositions of things. There are not women and men here, but rather the perambulatory stuff that is subject to the whims of a preponderance of power. As Colin Diane puts it, women in Saint-Domingue, for instance, where the nuns in Cap Francais, mulatto courtesans, black slaves, or white Creole wives were vessels for the taxonomic vocations of white male supremacy, obsessed with naming things and fixing them in static and definitive order. The description holds adroitly for the Southern colonial body of law, and especially its disposition on enslaved black women and their determination of the status of children. Thomas Morris, in his massive study, Southern Slavery and the Law, 1619 to 1860, takes up the problem of the partus sequitur when trim in the second chapter of this text. He calls it the first statutory provision on status, and it is adopted in Virginia in 1662. Quote, "All children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother." Morris launches his investigation of this maxim because he is trying to discover if the Southern colonies seek their legal precedents in this case, and slave law in general, from English common law or civil law. My interest here, however, is caught by other details, some of which I spelled out at the beginning of this lecture, but there's something else with which I want to close, and it is this. More than any other provision, this one, to my mind, draws out in stunning clarity the moral disaster that slavery was and the degree to which the crucifixion of Canaan devolves on the nameless, faceless female who bears the weight, if we can make this figure work, of the stain. As Morris explains it, the law of 1662 did not contain the Latin phrase, nor did any other Southern statute to the end of slavery in 1865. In his reading, then, the law was adopted to efface uncertainty concerning the status of mulattoes and represents an example of what he calls intellectual sloppiness in legal theory. When Blackstone, in his commentaries, discussed the principle of partus sequitur when trim, he treated it largely as a rule to determine the ownership of the increase of personal property. And here common and civil law agreed, according to Morris. In the mid-18th century, Blackstone put the matter thusly: of all tame and domestic animals, the brood belongs to the owner of the dam or mother. The English law agreeing with the civil that partus sequitur when trim in the brute creation, though for the most part in the human species it disallows the maxim. Morris argues that Blackstone at this point treated the Latin phrase not as a rule that determined the status of someone, but as a rule that determined the ownership of something. The dilemma of the Virginia Burgesses was whether or not they were thinking of mulattoes from a 1655 case that I can explain if anybody wishes to talk about it, whether or not they were thinking of mulattoes as persons, and if so, according to Morris, the law of bastardy would hold that the child followed the mother, or thinking of mulattoes in terms of property rights, in which case chattel property law required that the increase go to the owner of the mother. So Blackstone, Morris argues, in his synthesis of English law, had squeezed together a rule of status and the rule of property under the same Latin phrase. In any case, we do not see women here. In fact, humanity reduced to movable chess pieces against a ground of public figures in a dance of ego is obscured. We are today, as Enlightenment legatees, and for all the distance we've come, we think, still searching for her place on the horizon. Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Hortense.
Thank you.
May I have microphone on the around? Questions? Comments. One of the things about the story of Anthony Johnson, that with, you know, you started off the Hortense, the black
Yes.
and me.
Okay.
The black indentured servant who was so free at the beginning. He
Yeah.
didn't last very long. And by the time of his death, his children lost everything. So that it's a great, if you just, when you do the book, just expand a little bit about the arc of his life within 30 years, the
It's
freedom
over.
that he enjoyed initially is all taken away. And what his son, what they called the estate Angola, very interesting.
That he found it, right?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
then, I can't remember if it was that one or when they moved. They were forced to move. The environment turned very, very hostile. So that arc
Yes.
of his individual freedom and privilege, and then it being taken away,
Yeah.
fits within a 30-year period or 40-year period, fits your theory, your thesis very well. Even better, the fact that it was taken away than
Okay.
just suspended out there,
So
suggesting
that
that it
somewhere
was...
around 1650, 1660, that.
Yeah, I write about, it's in The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, and I dramatize that in the film.
Okay,
too.
great.
Yes.
Yeah.
Coming.
Professor Spillers,
Yes.
I admire the clarity and the analytical strength with which in these two lectures you have placed the enslaved black body at the core of central categories of modernity, and I am especially referring to the discussion you developed yesterday around what you call the division of labor between the private and the public, whereby the private is the realm of affects and feelings, the public is the idea of property owning as a precondition of political participation, political belonging. I would add civil society, I mean, this most cherished icon of liberal discourse, which brings me to the question, I mean, if we locate the origins of civil society in this modality of turning humans into things, I mean, systematic anti-blackness, one might want to say, then the question is, and it is a question that I'm grappling with in my own work, so I have specific interest in asking it.
Yeah.
Are we talking about just an archaeology of the present or a genealogy of the present? I mean, in which ways can this type of articulation can be used to build a genealogy of the present and of fundamental ideas and positionalities that structure political contestation, conflict, debate in the present?
Yeah.
It's a question that is, I mean, it's like, you know, I might want to recall here Frank Wilders's kind of provocation that the critique of political economy has never really explained to us when or whether Lincoln freed the slaves. So, yes, I would like you to comment on this archaeology versus genealogy type of discussion.
Okay. If I'm understanding you, are you saying that, are you asking whether or not a slave economy speaks to our situation now?
Yes,
Is
well,
that-
I mean, the type of, because, I mean, there is another word, in fact, that comes to my mind that you used quite a lot yesterday, a word with which I sympathize, which is paradigmatic. And it seemed to me that you actually reclaimed a project rooted in a kind of paradigmatic critique that derives from this kind of violent separation of private and public, and how in the public realm, basically, a civil society was constituted to anti-blackness. My question, I guess, is to what extent does that survive the juridical abolition of slavery, the legal transcendence of the position of the slave in the post-emancipation age, and therefore characterizes times that are closer to us, even at present.
You know, in my view of this, freedom is never won once and for all, right? I mean, it's really ongoing, so that we can still today talk about slavery and freedom, but we would have to talk about it in very different ways. And one of the ways that I think about it is that what happened to the African population on these shores was really a dress rehearsal for what happens to the American population, period. So that if you do not pay attention to what happens to so-called minorities, you're really not paying attention to the ways that history moves. So that it seems to me we are always about the business of gaining freedom again and reassuring freedom once again. So that, you know, these documents really mean that you may reach a point of saturation, but you really have to keep going. So that for me, the model of slavery is really a human model or a human paradigm, so that its message is really quite broad and universal in that sense. I think we're still working on the story of freedom, of the historical apprenticeship that is about freedom, you know, losing and gaining all the time. I think that, well, looking at this society, sometimes I think, well, what does freedom mean in fact, right? I don't know if we have defined it very well for who and where we are now, right? But that's the way I'm hearing your question. You want to say more about? Okay, all right, good.
But were you asking how much of slavery is still with us?
Well, very much yes. I mean, that is to say, in a sense, I'm quite satisfied with the response. I mean, that is to say, a context in which freedom is something that we felt important to over and over again. I mean, considering that how acquired freedom is as a value and as a practice in the type of society in which we live in.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Is all right. You know, if you think about, and I think about this quite a lot, I'm remembering, and well, this will say approximately how old I am. It's like you don't already know that. But, you know, I remember pre-Roe v. Wade in this country. As a matter of fact, I was a graduate student in Massachusetts at the neighboring school, Brandeis, in the late 60s, 68, 69, and finished Brandeis in 74. So I remember all of that and the terror of those years. We've been through that. But here we are today. And if you listen to discourse in American political life, it's absolutely terrifying for people of my generation. Thinking back on what it was in 1968 and 1969 in relationship to young women. I mean, it's absolutely amazing to me how politicians talk about the bodies of women, how they possess and own the body of women as a part of their political work, and that they don't drop that something doesn't come down and strike them when you talk all that fucking nonsense. Or why women don't start assassinating people talking silliness, right? And so that's an example of what I mean. You know, you take one step and then you take two back. Or what happened at the level of what happened at the Supreme Court with voting rights last year, right? And I look at that majority and I just, I wonder what are they thinking? What in the world are they thinking? I mean, what are you talking about? Original intent. And so those are all examples to me of what we're up against in the 21st century when we're supposed to have gained so much. I mean, it seems to me that every day those gains are on the line or are at stake, right? Every time we walk into a voting booth.
If, as you say, the treatment of the African body in America was a precursor to what happened to the American population in general,
Yeah, that's what I
and we
think.
can take the case of Anthony Johnson as an example of both cases of this,
Yeah.
then it would seem to me that with Du Bois and Black Reconstruction, noting that the major issue had to do with labor.
Let's say it again. That
The major issue had to do with labor, and thus in the South, right, the white laborer was a wage slave. So Du Bois tries to get below race also to look at the deeper issue. Then it seems to me that each time that you focus on race, you also have to focus on something more than race in order to give us a vocabulary to understand the nature of the beast, which is not racial. What is it?
Yeah, that's the enigma. What is it? But it works through race. I mean, it seems to me that it works through all those categories, right?
Well,
But if you talk about a synthesis of all those, what would you call them? Elements or punctualities or currencies. I mean, they are all it, right? So that if it's not race, it's gender, it's race and gender, it's also class, yes.
yes, but these are all symptoms of something far more problematic. No, I don't think it's economics either. I think it has to do with the way in which we wean people, we train people to become affectively, emotionally indifferent to the interests of others
Mm-hmm.
because of the social context. I think this was laid out very well in, what is his name? The guy who wrote The Nazi Doctors, in which he interviewed the surviving doctors, wanting to know how could a doctor perform the atrocities that they did
Yes.
within the death camps.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what he discovered, that you took a perfectly healthy doctor, normal person, and you put him in Auschwitz, and for 2 weeks, he had a psychotic break, emerged from which was a split consciousness in which there was the loving father and the Nazi doctor.
Mm.
And so he concluded, how can you prevent Nazi doctors? Oh, it's very easy. You can't have Auschwitz. Primo Levi makes the same kind of claim as a Jew had privilege in Auschwitz. And thus, he can't blame the Jews or the guards because of the conditions themselves. So, okay.
Yeah, I think it's a problem of which is not new vocabulary at all. It's a problem of the human, right? Yeah, it is the problem of the human. But in order to get at that problem, you have to go through a number of surrogates or alibis for the problem itself. And that's, I think race is such an alibi. That gender is such an alibi. I mean, those are actual things, sexual plumbing, pigmentation. I mean, those are real things, but they become alibis, they become ways to blind oneself to what the problem actually is, so that it is a kind of magic that racism, for instance, does to the subject of racism, right?
In this way, we become confused in that the act can be racist, but the motivation doesn't have to be racist, and its foundation is not.
Well, the foundation is not the act, may or may not be. I think that a lot of racism is mimetic. People do it not because they have something against me or against you. They do it because somebody else did it. Yeah.
I know, we gotta open this up.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, Louis?
Is that Tandika?
Yeah.
Hi. I do you. Hi.
Yes, well, I wanted to thank you for this talk. It's an interesting intellectual exercise in reading the Black Code. I'm afraid I have a very different reading of the same text, so I'll give you my version of it, and we'll see if we can reconcile it. In my view, it's a legal fiction, starting with the name that appears at the bottom, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. He had been dead for 2 years when the code appeared. He didn't author it. Louis XIV just put the name there as a homage to an important bureaucrat who had died 2 years earlier. And then the clauses in there, many of them are never enforced. In large part because the text